On December 6, 1941, 80% of the American people wanted to stay out of the war in Europe. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which led to America's entry into the Second World War against the Axis powers. Here to explain how and why that happened is Robert Stinnett. He's a media fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. He's a former journalist and photographer for the Oakland Tribune, earned 10 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation while in the United States Navy from 1942 through 46, and is the author of the book Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor. Welcome to the show, Mr. Stinnett.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You were in the Navy during World War II. Was that in the Atlantic or in the Pacific?
In the Pacific.
And when did you begin to investigate unofficial truths about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, it wasn't until 1982 that I became interested in it, because I had read a book that we had a cryptographic monitor station in Honolulu prior to Pearl Harbor, and it was intercepting the messages of the Japanese fleet. That was the first time I heard about it. So I went to my editor at the Oakland Tribune and asked to get in on that story.
And what did you find?
I contacted the U.S. Navy, and they did confirm that they had a monitor station. That's where they're intercepting the messages of the Japanese fleet prior to December the 7th. And actually, they'd been listening to it for many months, and they were able to trace the organization for the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Wake, and Guam, and other U.S. and allied positions in the Pacific.
So it wasn't just the diplomatic codes that they had broken. They had broken actually all the Japanese naval codes as well.
That is right. Most of your listeners and those who read the history of World War II are sort of familiar with the breaking of the Japanese diplomatic codes. But what was kept secret from all of the investigations of Pearl Harbor was that we had also broken the Japanese military codes. That's at least the Navy codes, and most likely the Army codes also. Though I've concentrated on the Japanese naval codes that were used to organize the attack on our bases there in the Pacific.
When you were a sailor back during World War II, what did you believe was the best intelligence of enemy ship movements?
Well, I believed all of the information that was released at that time, that the Japanese fleet was on radio silence and was not detected approaching Pearl Harbor or Guam or Wake or any of the other U.S. bases there in the Central Pacific. And it wasn't until 1982 that I learned different, and that's when I started the pursuit, trying to get the truth of this really momentous accomplishment of our cryptographers.
How many died at Pearl Harbor?
There was 2,500 soldiers and sailors, Marines, and civilians that were killed. That's in round numbers, and there were hundreds more injured.
Well, if our government had broken all the codes and knew that the Japanese Navy was on its way to attack Pearl Harbor, why didn't they stop them?
Well, the entire plan was to get Japan, militarists, to seize control of the Japanese government and attack us at Pearl Harbor. And then we provoked them into doing that. We cut off their oil. And the reason for that was to trigger a treaty that Japan, Germany, and Italy had signed called the Tripartite Pact. And that was signed in September 1940. And about 10 days later, the U.S. Navy came up with a plan to trigger that pact by using 8 provocations against Japan that the author of the said would cause them to institute an overt act of war against the United States, and that was what was the entire U.S. strategy. And the idea was to get us in the war with Germany, which is the real enemy as far as U.S. planning was concerned.
And in your book, you reproduce this memo by a naval intelligence officer named Arthur McCollum from October 7th, 1940. And it is, as you just said, an 8-point or 8 provocation plan to maneuver the Japanese into firing the first shot. What were those 8 steps?
Yes, that is correct. In our discussion here, I'm calling them provocations. He called them 8 actions that he said would cause Japan to commit an overt act of war. One of them was one of the actions was to send U.S. Cruiser divisions into Japanese territory and provoke the Japanese with really invading their territory. Another was to send submarines squadrons into the Far East, and another was to give aid to China, which was at war with Japan at that time. Another was to cut off all oil supplies and embargo steel and war supplies for the Japanese economy and for their for their structure. Other was to get British and Dutch to join us in the same type of embargoes, and these were slowly instituted against Japan. And the final one was in July 1941, just about 5.5 months before Pearl Harbor, which was a total embargo, and our American cryptologists saw that as Japan had no place to go but for war. But all this information was kept from the Hawaiian commanders. That was Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, because we wanted this overt act of war to come on Hawaii and enrage the American public so that we could trigger that tripartite pact that I mentioned.
Now, this 8-action memo, I have to say, my friend Anthony Gregory works at the Independent Institute in Oakland and has held this document in his hands and read it too. How did you get this 8-action memo by Arthur McCollum?
Well, when I started research on this project in 1982 and in 83, I had asked to see all of the documents involving Japanese plans for attacking Pearl Harbor. And this was addressed to the U.S. Navy, who had custody of these records. But I was denied access to them until 1995. And at that time, the Navy did release thousands of documents. And on the very first day that I started on this McCollum memo came in one of the boxes. I had no idea it was there. It had never been reported in any of the investigations of Pearl Harbor, and there were about 9 of them. No other media or authors had written about them. So I came across that in January 1995 and realized that if this was true and that I could document these provocations, that I had a real cause for the overt war action.
And did you find?
Pursued, and it took me all of 1995 to check out those 8 actions.
And you're saying that the United States government did indeed implement all 8 of the actions recommended in McCollum's memo?
That is right, and President Roosevelt authorized his chief of naval operations or his army chief, and it's all documented in the White House records, the Army records, and the Navy records, and State Department, FBI records also confirm this. Were all placed into effect.
Mr. Stinnett, you're making the case that the national government of the United States aided and abetted the mass murder of thousands of Americans by a foreign power, and yet in your book you say that you feel it was justified. How could this be?
Well, at the time, in fact, I documented in the book, there was an isolation movement in this country led by Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, the industrialists, Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest, who was a very popular radio priest, and others. There was a huge movement. 80% of Americans wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. The danger to our country was from Germany, and not so much from Japan, because Japan could be cut off at any time. And it was to end this isolation movement and get Japan to attack us, and then trigger that tripartite pact. It was a backdoor approach to war, and many people had suggested that was true during the investigations of the 1940s. But no one had the proof because it was all locked up in Navy vaults. And I was fortunate to be able to get these of the Freedom of Information Act in January 1995.
I'm sorry, sir, but the sacrifice of a few for the greater good seems a lot like the ideology that America was supposedly fighting in World War II.
Well, you're right. That is of course, that premise was used early in 1848 by President Polk in the Mexican War, where authors of including U.S. Grant, the president who then was in the Army, they provoked Mexican troops in starting the Mexican War, and then President Abraham Lincoln used the provocation policy at Fort Sumter. I think more people know about it, the USS Maine and the Havana Harbor in 1898 that got us the Spanish-American War. And it's a policy that's been used
the Lusitania as well,
earliest times.
The Lusitania as well that got us into World War I.
Yes, all right, there's another one. Yes, that's right.
And the Gulf of Tonkin and inviting Iraq into Kuwait. This sort of
absolutely and
seems like we've been lied into every war since the War for Mexico.
That is, at least as far as the United States is concerned, and certainly the weapons of mass destruction is a provocation-type policy.
And for those interested in that, stay tuned in 15 minutes or so. We're going to be talking to Jude Winiski all about the, the Pearl Harbor version, or the Iraq version of the Pearl Harbor lie to get us to invade that country. In any case, I think we should get back a little bit more to the details here, Mr. Stinnett. In your book, you say that there were 36 men who were inside the loop and were allowed to read the transcripts of the decoded naval transmissions. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. There are probably many more because you have to include the operators, the intercept operators, the cryptographers that are actually intercepting these messages that were in Japanese Morse code, the dot dash. It's a dot dash system, but it's entirely different than which we were all familiar with Morse code of the 1940 era. But these operators knew, as well as the leaders of our government at the time.
And you talk in your book about how the intercept stations that were picking up all this radio traffic from the Japanese were actually located all throughout the Pacific and even at Hawaii. And yet the commanders did not know, while people below them were on the inside. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. And there were 25 monitor stations in the Pacific basin. They went from the west coast of the United States up to Alaska, and then down in China and in the Netherlands, the East Indies, and a British station at Singapore. All of these were monitoring the Japanese fleet frequencies and also the Japanese Army frequencies. So both the United States and Great Britain and the Dutch, because they controlled the Netherlands, East Indies at the time. So they were all listening to these messages. We had radio direction finders. We could locate the Japanese warships when they broke radio silence, and then you could locate them where they were in the Pacific.
So MacArthur at the Philippines, he knew that Pearl Harbor was about to be attacked himself.
Yes, he did, because his cryptographers were monitoring the Japanese Imperial Army radio frequencies, and they intercepted a message that the war would start on December 8th, so that was Tokyo time, or December 7th, Hawaii time.
And do you have proof in your declassified documentation that this information was being received at the highest levels of the military, or do you just know where it wasn't going?
Well, we know that it was received in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Navy headquarters, but